Hello and welcome to Strategic News International, Dr. Darren Byler. Dr. Byler is a lecturer on social anthropology at the University of Washington, and one of his areas of focus has been the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang province of China. And let me begin by asking you about the recent New York Times report on the general persecution of the Uyghur population in the Xinjiang province of China. What are your views on this report?
hmm The report is an important one because it confirms a lot of the reporting that has been done in the past, but that has really been drawn on resources or sources that are outside of the center of power. These documents, 400 pages that the New York Times has collected, really focus on the speeches, the directives from Xi Jinping, the party secretary of China, and the party secretary of the region of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, a man named Chen Chuangguo. And what they say is that, starting with Xi Jinping in 2014, that they were saying they should show no mercy to the Uyghurs, um, especially the Uyghurs that have been, what they say, infected by a virus of Islam, a certain kind of Islam. But as you read through the documents, you begin to realize that they are really referring to almost any form of Islam, that Islam itself is the target of this campaign of re-education. And so the important thing that comes from these documents is that it's coming from the very center of power in China. And it's not simply some rogue officials that are, acting in extreme ways towards Uyghurs. It's actually coming from the very center of the administration.
Yes, in fact, the report also mentions how President Xi himself has passed directives to party officials on how the Uyghur population is to be dealt with. And would you say that it's very serious, given that this is coming right from the very top? And the Chinese authorities have all along claimed that this is basically just re-education or these are just vocational training centers, but actually masquerading as detention camps.
hmm So what the documents show is that beginning already in 2014, Xi Jinping began to give these directives, but they didn't really take force until 2016, which is when this new party secretary Chen Chuangguo arrived.
Mhm.
And his orders to everyone that was in his administration in Xinjiang was to round up everyone that needed to be rounded up. Those are the words that they repeated over and over again. And those that showed mercy, that didn't round up, those that they were supposed to round up, were punished. So over 12, I think it's 12,000 officials were reprimanded for not following orders as closely as they were supposed to.
Mhm.
Um, and another section in the documents speaks to what officials are supposed to say to the children of those that are detained. They
Yes.
are supposed to tell them that this is for their parents' own benefit. This is the government caring for them, and they shouldn't question anything about their parents being taken. Um, One of the things that comes through in that is that they say, what if the student or the child asks us, well, my parent only watched one unapproved message or was only part of a WeChat group for one time, sometime in the past. Should they still be detained? And the answer is yes, of course, we should show no mercy. We have to detain everyone. So
Yeah.
what it's showing is that even the most minor form of a kind of offense results in these sorts of detentions.
So what are these offenses like? There've already been reports, for instance, that the Chinese authorities are actively discouraging the use of Islamic symbols. For instance, even the use of, for women to cover their heads or other religious symbols. And so, what kind of surveillance is on really in this Xinjiang region? And if I'm not mistaken, you have spent a year living there between 2014 and 15. So
Mhm.
what was it like then? What did you see there?
In 2014, when I lived there for a year, I saw the beginnings of what they call the People's War on Terror,
Hmm.
which in the beginning stages were posters that were placed throughout the Uyghur neighborhoods that said it's now no longer permitted for men to have beards, for women to veil themselves or to have any sort of Islamic symbols on their clothing. And
Mm-hmm.
already back then, we began to see people disappear, be taken by the state and put into some sort of camp or detention, but at a lower scale. Um, since 2016, it's really escalated. They've begun to implement a de-extremification campaign, is how they refer to it, and they've come up with 75 signs of extremism. These are very wide-ranging. It could be, not refusing to smoke, refusing to drink alcohol, could be having a beard or these other things that I've already mentioned. But it could be other things that are related to technology, like having WhatsApp on your phone, or Twitter or Facebook, or having a VPN. Those are all signs of extremism, I guess, because it allows the person to have access to forms of media that the state doesn't want them to have access to.
Now, other reports, there have been reports, as per the New York Times again, that, and I'm reading this out to you, is that there are, say, about a million Uyghurs who are facing this kind of detention. Or is that an exaggerated number?
It is an estimate. So I would say that the closest estimate we have is probably something on the order of 1.5 million people. This includes Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim groups,
Mhm.
Kazakhs in particular.
Kazakhs, yes.
Um, so the way that if we're able to get towards those numbers is we have satellite images of many of these facilities, and you can, based on that, you can estimate the capacity of these spaces because you can see the floors. We know from survivor accounts, people that have come out of the camps, the sort of crowded conditions in many of them. But it is still an estimate because the state does not allow open access to these camps to actually, survey them, and they also don't release the numbers. Um, but I would say that 10% of the population in these camps is a very reasonable estimate.
What is happening in these detention camps? You said that, of course, they don't allow access to these camps, but according to reports, what is going on in these camps? What kind of re-education? Is just brainwashing, or
Mhm.
is there some kind of physical uh, punishment also involved in these camps?
Well, before people are sent to the camp, there's usually an assessment process. So they are held in detention centers, which function as kind of black sites, where there's no legal representation and quite a lot of interrogation and investigation. And in those cases, that's where you see the greatest amount of abuse, physical abuse and things like that through interrogation. If it's determined that the person hasn't done enough to be given a criminal sentence, which over 500,000 people, according to Chinese statistics, official statistics, have been given criminal sentences over the last 2 years in the Xinjiang region. If it doesn't rise to that level, then they are sent to the camp. Um, in the camp space, it's run as a sort of medium security prison, which means that they are held in dormitory style cells, group cells. Um, and it's also run in some ways as a sort of boot camp. So you wake at 6 a.m., make your bed, go out, raise the flag, sing the national anthem, sing red songs, patriotic songs, and then you begin classes. So sometimes the classes are focused on ideology, really focused on the, the teachings that are coming from Xi Jinping and others in administration. Um, and then there's also instruction in language. One of the things that they're really focusing on is training Uyghurs to speak Chinese. I would say around 90% of those that are in the camps are rural, people that have less formal education and less training in Chinese. So they're coming to these camps with varying degrees of Chinese education. And that's one of the things that they're focusing on. As you move through the camp system, you gain points towards the eventual transfer to factory work. Many people are being transferred to factory work um, as they progress through the system. So that means that they've passed language tests, they've passed ideology tests, and they've presented themselves as now re-educated. There's also some psychological trauma that's associated with this process. Often people are asked to stand and confess their crimes, which is studying the Quran or learning Arabic or praying outside of the mosque, whatever the crime is. And then others are asked to criticize them. And they do this on a regular basis. And so, in effect, what they're doing is sort of denouncing their Islamic faith and instead embracing Chinese ideology.
So, in effect, what the Chinese authorities seem to be doing is to be wiping out an entire culture, a race with this kind of indoctrination and persecution. Would it be correct to say this?
I think it's certainly accurate to say it's a kind of cultural genocide, but
Mm-hmm.
it's a slow acting one. Oftentimes, when we think of genocide, we think of it as, a violent oppression of a group of people. Mass killing often is associated with it. That's not
Mm-hmm.
what this looks like. We haven't seen mass death. Instead, it's a long process of sort of relearning how to be a person. Um, there's also a lot of targeting of basic institutions of the society. So it's now Islamic practice, mosque attendance, those sorts of things are not really permitted any longer, except for the
Mm-hmm.
very elderly. So that basic institution is taken away. The family structure itself is being fragmented as well. So the
Mm-hmm.
parents are being separated from their children, not just those that are in the camps, but also more widely, people are being sent to work in factories. Children are being sent to boarding schools or sort of residential schools, where the only medium of exchange is Chinese. So these children are separated at a very young age from their parents and trained in Chinese. So in that sense, we can see that there is this transformational effect that's happening. Maybe the current generation that's in the camps won't be fully transformed, but I think the state feels as though the next generation will be.
Darren, could you also share with us your views on the Chinese attempts to change the demographic pattern in Xinjiang? They have been settling the Han Chinese in huge numbers in the region, and what is the situation on that front?
hmm So a lot of the tension that we see in this region began with population transfer programs or incentives. And this really began in the 1990s with a campaign called Open Up the West, which sent large numbers of Han settlers to the Uyghur region, mostly as for economic opportunities, and mostly in key industries related to natural gas, oil, coal, and more recently cotton and tomato farming.
Mm-hmm.
So they're kind of key resources for the Chinese economy. Most of these new economies excluded Uyghur workers. So Uyghurs saw themselves being pushed off of their land, and also they saw the cost of living begin to rise, and that produced all kinds of tension that forced them to become more desperate to move to the city to trying to find work where they couldn't find work. Lots of racial profiling happening in the cities. So that's really what's led to a lot of the protests and violence, which the state sees as terrorism. Um, and in some cases, there is ways that you could frame it as terrorism. So I'm not saying that there are no reasons why the state would respond in certain ways. But in most cases, it's responses to this population transfer. Um, in most recent context, since this re-education camp system began,
Mm-hmm.
the state has begun to enforce family planning policies for Uyghurs much more seriously. So at this point, Uyghurs are permitted to have two children, but having more than two results in being sent to the camp for violating family planning. At the same time, Han people that have moved to the region are now permitted to have three children in at least some cases. So they're really increasing the Han population through the regulations while decreasing the Uyghur population. And so we see that transforming the system. One of the most interesting statistics is that in the last 2 years, we've seen a 5% drop in population in reproduction, biological reproduction in the
Uyghurs?
population in the Xinjiang region. So that includes the Han population as well. But typically, the trend was a 2% growth in population through childbirth. In this case, it's now gone backwards. It might be because of the family planning. It's probably more likely, though, related to the camp system and parents being separated from children from each other, and people just not having children.
And my final question to you, Darren, is that despite all this, the persecution of the Uyghurs, why is the world silent on their plight? Is it because China is a powerful nation? So other countries don't really want to take on the Chinese might. What do you think the reasons are?
There's a whole range of them. One of them has to do with the current American administration being one that doesn't want to align itself with others and build coalitions. Um,
Yeah.
Others have to do with the Uyghurs being a stateless population that really doesn't have institutional support in major political bodies. But probably the primary reason is that China is a very powerful nation. It is one of the largest economies in the world, and its Belt and Road Initiative puts it in direct trade relations with much of the developing world. And so many economies are dependent on China, on having good relations with China, and pushing back against China on this issue would not be in their best interest, as, in terms of their economy. Most nations, I think, don't see human rights as something that takes priority over their economy, and so I think it's a lack of political will in many senses. I think as we continue to get the news into the mainstream and start to kind of show people what is actually happening in this sort of slow motion way, this sort of slow motion genocide. I think there may be more pushback. I think these documents that are coming from the New York Times help to do some of that because it shows that it's really coming from the state apparatus itself.
Darren, thank you so much for talking to SNI. It was a pleasure having you with us.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.